Welcome to the Gallimaufric Science Podcast, a podcast about science, art, and culture. My name is Tommy, and joining me are two of my co-hosts, Scott and Raven. Zach couldn't be here with us this particular week. This episode is part 2 of our two-part discussion on the Netflix documentary Alien Worlds. If you want to check out part 1 of our discussion, head on over to Gallimaufric Science Podcast to find part 1. Let's move on over to episode 3 of Alien Worlds, which is of Eden. I guess the name implies that this is a planet that is very vibrant with life. It's full of life. And what did Netflix give us?
Well, it was a lot lusher than what came before, but not exactly as lush as you might expect in, like, say, a rainforest or anything like that.
Which they did throw over some footage of,
Yeah.
which had some very interesting looking animals that were far more interesting, once again, than anything that they showed on their Alien Worlds.
Indeed.
So with episode 3, with Eden, basically, I felt like when they were designing this exoplanet, they basically got Earth, and then they go, what if Earth, but a bit more? So, for example, Earth has a 23-degree tilt in its axis. They go, okay, well, Earth got 23 degrees. We'll make ours 40 degrees. Earth's got 21% atmospheric oxygen. Well, we'll give it 31% atmospheric oxygen. Earth's got
one sun. We're gonna give it two.
And that's basically it, but without following through on the implication of any of that. Like having that 40-degree tilt would make for some really extreme seasons. But having those two stars, do they even have like seasons as we know it? And having the 31% atmospheric oxygen, that would change the conditions a lot, like in terms of fire, which is a thing that, we are all familiar with on this podcast. Me living in Australia and you guys up there in Alaska, you get really wildfires. Imagine that being fueled by 31% oxygen. We didn't see any of that. So it seems like they just got Earth and go, well, what if Earth, but a bit more, but didn't follow through with any of the implications of that?
Yeah, it was a very curious approach to making an alien planet that's supposed to be, well, alien.
So they have this introduction into Eden, which is supposed to be like, oh, this very vibrant forest. And of course, as with any bog standard documentary that have like an entry shot into a forest, they have to have the generic bird noises, don't they?
Yeah, there's a lot of that in stock footage and stuff like that in general anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess it was unsurprising to hear a lot of it here too.
Yeah. And one thing that I kind of noticed is they make out Eden as if it's like, oh, this is like some kind of super Earth because it's like it's Earth condition, but more so. But the thing is Eden has like 31% atmospheric oxygen, right?
Right.
But during the Carboniferous period, it's been estimated that Earth atmospheric content was estimated to be 35% oxygen. So basically, the note that I wrote down is like, hang on a sec. So Eden, with its twin stars, and the idea behind this particular episode is that, oh, it's got these two stars fueling all that photosynthesis in Eden. And that's why all the plant life there is able to pump out 31% oxygen. But at the same time, Earth during the Carboniferous period managed to pump out 35% atmospheric oxygen with only the one star. And the conclusion that I could only draw from this is basically the meme of virgin Eden photosynthesis versus Chad Carboniferous Earth. And certainly, everything that was alive during the Carboniferous on Earth were far more interesting than any of the things that we saw on Eden.
A higher rate of oxygen gave us much larger insects, for example.
Yes, that's correct. We had like larger terrestrial arthropod. In fact, if not the largest terrestrial arthropod of all time in the form of Arthropleura, which was this ginormous millipede-like arthropod that grew to over 2 meters long. And then you have things like Meganeura, which were these insects that were related to dragonflies that had wingspans of about 75 centimeters, so about 30 inches. Ginormous insects. You got the ancestors of present-day mayflies and cockroaches. They were extremely numerous. And also the plant life were also very, very different as well, because, they had these forests filled with trees that are over 30 meters tall, but they the kind of trees that we have today, which are mostly either gymnosperms, like for example, pine trees, or angiosperms, flowering plants. They were these things that were related to like club moss. So to be honest, watching this episode on Eden, I find myself wanting to watch a documentary about the Carboniferous period.
Yeah. We didn't see anything like that. We've sort of focused on just the 2 or 3 organisms really that they wanted us to see.
And that seems to be a common theme throughout the series is they say, oh, this, lush vibrancy or whatever, but they don't show it. And, it made more sense to only have 3 things shown during like the episode with the pentapods. But, you're talking about like a super Earth with all this diversity because of the oxygen. And it's like, well, where's the rest of it?
Yeah, I can understand that because of technical limitation, they can only like make so many different aliens and animate so many different of them.
Right, but they didn't even have like an insect analog, like no flies or weird things flying around, nothing like that.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing about the show, because they seem to have conflated analog with like taxonomic group, because the main star of Eden, I have to argue, is probably that fungi, right? But they explicitly call it a fungus. They didn't say an alien that have convergently evolved, seeing how they've already introduced the concept of convergent evolution in the previous episode. They didn't say it's a alien life that live like a fungus, or even like, called like fungi analog or whatever. They explicitly say it's a fungi, but fungus are not a functional group. It's not like predators or parasites or grazers that describe what a thing does, but not necessarily denotes a particular taxonomic group. Fungus is a particular taxonomic group that evolved on Earth. So you can't just say, oh, it's a fungi, which imply like, what is this panspermia going on that you're implying here?
Maybe.
So they talked about the fungi and the important role they play in this particular ecosystem, which I guess in a roundabout way, I do appreciate that point, because they do play a very important role in the ecosystem. They interviewed the biologists who talked about the mycorrhizal fungi network, which I was waiting for it. It's like that episode where Bart got famous for saying, eat my shorts. It's like, say the wood wide web, because that is like a catchphrase for describing the mycorrhizal fungi network. It's like, when's he going to say it? When's he going to? Yes, he said the wood wide web. And, we talked a little bit about that back in the episode where we're talking about Wayne Barlow's expedition, when we ended up talking about Avatar, James Cameron's Avatar, and I talked about how out of all the things that were in James Cameron's Avatar, that thing where those alien people connect onto what I call the forest internet, that actually has basis in real biology, that these mycorrhizal fungi connect all of these trees together. And there's a lot of very interesting biology as well. Once again, this is the 3rd time while talking about the show that I want to plug that book, Entangled Life, about fungi by Merlin Sheldrake, because it's really, really good. Talking about the way that basically these fungi allocate carbon between different individual trees that are connected onto the network. The fungi are essentially they're like internet service provider, but more so for the inhabitant of this forest. And they didn't really talk much about that. Instead, they go for the whole zombie ant fungi angle, which surprisingly enough, once they went for that angle, they didn't cut to footages of zombie ant fungi. I was really that was the weirdest cut out of all the separate cuts.
That was the weirdest cut. It's like, why aren't you talking about these?
Yeah, because they went from like, okay, you got those like what you called one time the moth rabbits?
Moth rabbits, yeah.
Yeah. That feeds on the fungus thing, and then they get the spores, and then it makes them really drowsy, which makes them easier prey for those mogwai predator things. And then it's supposed to be that the fungus then use that as a way to infect the mogwai, but which brings up question, based on my familiarity with fungi, why don't the fungi just use the moth rabbit as substrate to grow? Why bother going through the moth rabbit unless the mogwai has some special thing going on that the fungi need, but they didn't explain that or even hinted at that. Because there is some really interesting kind of like animal fungi interaction, because let's drop all pretense about these things being aliens. They're so bog standards that, they're basically animals and fungus. But there are some really interesting animal fungus interaction that goes on, apart from the whole zombie ant fungus thing, where the fungus takes over the behavior of an ant and other insects and makes them crawl to places where they're better able to disperse the spores. Another example that is kind of far less, I guess, far less scary example of fungi animal interaction with truffles. So truffles, they have fruiting bodies that needs to be dispersed by animals, and they emit a scent that can be dug up by like pigs and other animals to eat them and then disperse the spores with a bit of fertilizer on the way. So of course, I'm going to a lot more detail, a lot more interesting things than the show gave fungi any credit for. So
yeah.
But that particular cut going from the drowsy moth rabbit over to the honeyguides and the honey hunters using the honeyguide to tell them where to, like, that was really interesting. But what the heck does it have to do with the whole,
That's exactly what we were thinking. Yeah.
Because I guess if you kind of cut through all the dross and all of that stuff, you could say that, okay, well, it's a form of like interspecies interaction or symbiosis. In the case of the fungus and the moth rabbits, it's a parasitic interaction, whereas in this case, it's a mutualism. But once again, they didn't really
They didn't make that distinction at all. And they called it symbiosis by name, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, well, you are showing two very different kinds of symbiosis. Like, that was such a M. Night Shyamalan twist, because it's like, I was not expecting them to throw to the honeyguide bit, because that, while extremely interesting, doesn't really seem to correspond with the bit earlier. I was expecting they would throw to like some zombie ant fungus or caterpillar fungus type stuff, which is a closer analog of the whole rabbit thing. But once again, much like what I said about those sky grazer hatchlings, maybe they are worried about showing the hand in like, oh, this is what we're copied from in real life. Like, these are real life things that are even far more interesting than our supposed alien life. We don't want to show you that.
Speaking of the alien life and the rabbit moths, now their breeding cycle was kind of interesting, but the cocoon bit, I couldn't suspend my disbelief at all. The larval stage, see, that I'd buy, but it's like
I don't know whether they larval stage or whether an analog to like spermatophores, such as what's found in squid and leeches. So many of these invertebrates, they have, instead of just ejaculating out sperm in seminal fluid, they have these little packets, which are little packets of sperm that they then like stab into their mates, and that's how they actually mate. So I don't know whether that is supposed to represent that. The visual were really quite interesting to me because they look exactly like a specific type of tapeworm, which the Proteocephalus tapeworms is like, oh, this is exactly what, like, they found photos, scan electron microscope of that and go, oh, this is a really bizarre alienish looking thing. We'll make something out of that. Most viewers wouldn't know this is, they just go, wow, what a cool alien thing. But it's like, oh, I know these tapeworms.
Interesting. I did not make that association at all.
Yeah, well, it's got the four suckers. It's got like that's a skull-like. That's a skull-like structure.
Right.
So if you look up Proteocephalus on Google and Google image, you will find that exact looking thing that came out of the moth rabbit that they used to mate and turn into like the larval, incubating larval stage and stuff like that. So
interesting.
Yeah, and then they throw over to the evolution biologist to talk about the difference between an r-strategist, where you have many smaller offspring, versus a K-strategist, which is a few large offspring. But yeah, they didn't really explain that because they don't explain anything on the show. There's no time for that. We've got alien footages to show you.
Right. And, nothing in any of these worlds, in my opinion, in any of the episodes, it appears have evolved together on the same planet. It just, I don't get a sense of unity with, I mean, I'm not even talking like unity as in like character design across a theme. I'm talking as in like, okay, even though we have a lot of disparate animals, they somehow all seem to work together. You know what I mean? When you show them side by side.
Visually, right. Yeah.
Yeah, the bit that really made me laugh in this episode is when they have their Tarsier/monkey/mogwai thing, and those like fungi cord arms come shooting out.
Oh, what did you call them? What did you call them again? Because you called them something great in the last hangout.
Oh, yeah, Stretch Armstrong Tarsier.
I latched onto that thing. I've been laughing about that inside all week. So it's weird because they have 6 limbs, but nothing else on the planet does.
Also, it looks like they have like endoskeleton. It looks like they have bones, basically.
Yeah.
So having that Stretch Armstrong arm, and even the fingertips on those Stretch Armstrong arms looks like they have bones. And then it's like, it really throws you off. And also, I guess one of my pet peeve that comes up in many documentaries, not just this documentary, but many others, is when they describe a particular organism as perfectly evolved.
Oh, yes. I wanted to make a drinking game out of that for another documentary called Planet Dinosaur. And you could have killed yourself with how many times you had to take a drink for the guy every time he said perfectly suited.
Because that's just not how evolution works. Evolution is this mishmash of like makeshift solution to whatever it is that is just going on at the time. Nothing, by definition, nothing in evolution is ever perfect because the environment is constantly changing and you have to build upon a pre-existing body plan. You can't just go right down to the blueprints and build everything from the ground up. So by definition, you can say it's like well adapted, but you can't say it's like perfectly adapted, because when you think about a tree climbing animal, wouldn't something that looks like a long-legged, like a huntsman spider, be better at like climbing trees and jumping from trees to trees? As opposed to your awkward little mogwai thing that doesn't even have a tail.
Oh, I didn't even notice that until just now. Wow. Huh.
Yeah, neither did I.
Yeah, and especially because it's making such high speed maneuvers and stuff, but I guess you could argue that monkeys could do the same things.
Well, monkeys have tails.
Monkeys have tails, yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot. Once again, this episode, very rapid cuts in between different biologists, talking about the hummingbirds and then talking about those like little guppy things. And then throw over to the honey hunter, which, like I said, fascinating, but doesn't really correspond with the footage that lead up to that.
And this really makes me wonder if this shouldn't have been cut up, like I said in the previous episode, into 6 different episodes, as opposed to the 4 that they did here.
Yeah.
It's like, oh God, now we've got all this material and we got to fit it in somehow. Let's just cut a whole bunch of stuff.
Or something, yeah.
It just seems rather disjointed. Like I said previously, I can't tell whether they made the alien footage first and then find people to shoehorn into them, or whether they managed to shoot these particular segments and then try to design the aliens around them and shoehorn in whatever footage they can for the examples that they didn't manage to get the right people to talk about. One thing I want to bring up about the Honeyguide is that one thing the show didn't mention, which is very fascinating about the Honeyguide, is that they are actually brood parasites. So they're like cuckoos.
I didn't even know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, neither did I.
Oh, their brood parasitism of Honeyguide is fascinating because they're literally natural born killers. Like when the little hatchlings hatch, when they're still blind and naked, the first thing they do is murder.
So are they related to cuckoos or what?
No. They've independently evolved. Like brood parasitism has independently evolved in a few different groups of birds. In the cuckoos, in the cowbirds, and in the Honeyguide.
You hear that, paleo artists? More brood parasitism and paleo art hashtag. There you go. Sorry.
However, out of the birds living dinosaurs, only 1% are actually brood parasites. Some species actually engage in intraspecific brood parasitism where they don't parasitize another species, but they may lay the egg in the nest of like an unsuspecting neighbor or something like that instead of raising their own young. So there's different degrees of brood parasitism adaptations as well. But in terms of like the Honeyguide, they do the cuckoo or cowbird things and lay the eggs in that of like other species, which are host species. And as soon as they're born, the chicks start shanking the nestmate. They have these special beaks that ends in this really wicked hook. So they're literally natural born killers. That's really awesome. But they didn't talk about that in the show because that's the kind of show that this is.
Interesting. Huh.
well, fascinating, but I wish they had something that is like more tangentially related to lead into that instead of having but the rabbit moth thing and the fungi and all of that.
And nothing else. And you know, the other thing too about this episode is they brought up the fact that it was around a binary star, I guess to make it like more Earth than Earth, but it was kind of like it didn't matter in the greater context of the episode.
Yeah, that's what I mean by, oh, they have these two binary stars, but what does it mean in terms of like seasons? Because they made it so that, oh, it has a 40-degree tilt so that the season you would expect to be more extreme, but they didn't really show that.
No, and they didn't even put it in two shadows. Like if you have two suns, you got two shadows.
Yeah, it's almost like as if someone described Earth to them and they want to talk about their like, oh, my Canadian girlfriend as like is more cool than your Canadian girlfriend kind of a thing, where it's like, oh yeah, she does this and that. And basically, like I said earlier, they took Earth and it's like, what if we make it more? But they didn't think through the implications of all that.
Now, I can't remember. Did they actually go into what kind of stars they were circling? Like what brightness?
No, of course
No,
not.
they didn't do that.
Of course not. The closest thing they say to that is that they said more light means more life.
No, it doesn't.
Which once again is a thing that the show suffers from. It's just this really simplified general kind of a thing that when you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it kind of falls apart. Like, well, where else have a lot of light? Mercury.
Also, it shows kind of like a very shallow knowledge of science in general, really, because it's like I said on the previous episode there, we were discussing how limited it makes it when you're talking about alien worlds and you limit it to the concept of a male and a female when there's so many other different things going on out there, like with fungus and basically anything else other than mammals. And it's like, yeah, we have a very shallow perception of what it means to be circling a binary star. There's so much more to it. I mean, it's like you stopped at biology 101, but biology 102 and AP biology exists. Same thing with astronomy.
Yeah, that seems to be a prevailing issue or symptom of the series where they throw these ideas out there, but never really follow through and went for the most pedestrian possible depiction.
We don't want to blow your mind too much here, but
yeah, even though we're talking about aliens, yeah, it's frustrating. It made for a really frustrating watch because it's like, oh, you could have done this, you could have done that, especially following on from our episode where we talk about Wayne Barlow's expedition and how even though, like I said in that episode, it's meant to be an art project, so there are certain things in there that doesn't really make any biological sense. But at the same time, it seems that in Wayne Barlow's expedition, his animals often make more sense in universe than the things that we saw in alien worlds.
Right? Even if Wayne Barlow's book took a very Earth-centric view of evolution and biology itself, it still shows more of an understanding and more than just surface deep knowledge of what's going on here.
Yeah. And that really comes to a head in episode 4, which was the episode I was most frustrated with. So I'm going to brood on that and I'll let like either one of you start talking about episode 4 first.
Okay, so basically episode 4 was kind of interesting, and yet also the CG was the least interesting of the series, I thought. Because Eden, we went from really lush, really elaborate CG, even if, it wasn't to our satisfaction, at least it looked the part for the most part, to brains in boxes.
Not even the full brain, just like a single neuron, a single synapse, a single cell of a brain.
Of a hive mind. And that's interesting, but it also sort of kind of didn't work for me.
If this was an anime, I would probably say like, oh, this is getting into later episode where they're like running out budget and time. And so they try to throw things together.
That could be.
I don't know if this is actually the case for here, but maybe it's like, well, if we make them brains in jars in a greenhouse, then we can limit like what we have to create. And you mentioned the hive mind thing. And the thing is that they throw that out there, but they, once again, much like many of the things that were brought up in the Eden episode, they didn't follow through with like, okay, well, what does that mean? You just throw this word out there and it's like, what does this mean? And there was like no relevance to any of the things that happened in the rest of the episode.
And I think I mentioned that in the previous episode, that it seems like this was more a string of in-jokes for scientists than it was an actual like documentary.
I mean, in-jokes is a little bit generous because it's like, it's not really even clever or funny. When most of the time when I think of in-jokes, they're like really, really deep cuts, but they're not, there's nothing deep about the show. Most of the cuts are extremely shallow, not even skin deep.
And how much of that was like meddling from the studio, we'll never know.
Yeah, exactly. We're not privy to what went on with the production of the show. I'm sure there are people who are on that show that probably had different ideas, and maybe that's the reason why the show ended up being, but like, we don't know enough to guess at what happened. We can only discuss what we see. And what we saw at the opening of this particular episode was Area 51, because for some reason in a documentary, we need to entertain the whole ufologist Roswell. I don't know why they did that. Like, we've already established exoplanets and all that stuff.
Right? Oh God, I'd completely forgotten that, where they put in that fucking video and then they this is a video of an alien, and it's like, no, it's not, it's a fucking hoax. And they say, yeah, I just got you, it's a hoax. And it's like, oh my God, why couldn't you lead with that?
It's like, it's 20 when this show went on. Like, that had been established to be a hoax for like a very long time. And why are we in this documentary? Why are we entertaining this kind of like Discovery Channel bullshit?
Right.
With, you know, UFOs and all that kind of stuff. And then they throw over to the Drake equation, which, as you mentioned previously, they didn't mention at all.
They didn't even say what it was. It's just this guy is writing on the back of a napkin and talking about the number of stars and possible civilizations. And it's, Drake equation. And again, that's like what I've been calling an in-joke between scientists. I don't mean in-joke. I just don't have a better term for it.
Sure.
Well, that reminds me of the whole point of terraforming. I mean, they call it the planet Terra, but they don't use the word terraforming.
That was another thing about like all of this, I guess. And also, let's talk a little bit about the advanced civilization, because judging from the timeline of this planet, it's 9 billion years old. And given how contrived and unimaginative the show has been so far, I take it that on this planet, civilization arose at a similar time to when it arose on Earth, which is about like 5 billion years into the age of this planet. So I'm guessing that means the civilization is implied to have been around for 4 billion years. And so 4 billion years. And what did they do to themselves? They turned themselves into brains in jars, living in a greenhouse with a bunch of robots.
Yeah.
Is this like, you guys are perfect? Like, it's just a bit, I can't believe I'm roasting an imaginary alien, but like, I'm a science fiction nerd, so I've read about a lot of like different kinds of imagined alien civilization. This might be the most pathetic alien sapient species I have.
Loser alien civilization.
What a bunch of losers. Like, at the end, you know how you had this guy, this like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed guy, he's like, I want to talk to the aliens. It was like, I don't want to talk to these freaking punk-ass bitches. Like, why do I don't want to talk to them. I don't want anything to do with them at all. They spent their 4 billion years turning themselves into brains in jars. And the thing is that how the narrator goes on about how these aliens are like, they have completely let go of their body. They didn't explain why they did that. Like, okay, well, maybe it is a good idea, but they still clung on to having meat brains in jars.
Mm-hmm.
You would think 4 billion years, they would, you know, if you have read any kind of science fiction, you would know about like uploading or maybe transferring the consciousness onto a more durable and compact substrate that doesn't need to be fed with freaking algal soup all the time.
Even friggin' Star Trek in the 1960s had the concept of uploading your consciousness into some kind of machine for future use.
Oh, yeah.
And it's so kind of like unimaginative and so superficial, which is basically emblematic of this entire series. Because when you look at when they start the summary of this episode talking about how it's an hyper advanced civilization, that takes off a certain switch in my brain that I start having certain expectations about, like, Okay, hyper advanced civilization. What do we have here? I have some idea of hyper advanced civilizations that I've read in science fiction and all that. This is the episode where they just go all out sci-fi and talk about big ideas and all that stuff. And we're gonna have, probably I expected the least amount of biology, which is okay considering what the premise is. But the advanced civilization that they give us is brains in jars in a greenhouse serviced by robots.
Yeah. Not very interesting.
What a absolute letdown.
Why are they using chemical rockets?
Oh, convenience.
Did they use chemical rockets? They didn't explain how they float. Yeah.
That's kind of assumed, I thought, from the launch sequence that they showed.
Well, that's another thing too. I was expecting okay, so in this episode they're gonna go off to other worlds to start anew and stuff like that. Are they gonna talk about exotic forms of space propulsion? This is the perfect opportunity to maybe, talk to people at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, talk about ion engines, talk about possible nuclear drive, nuclear pulse drive, the Project Daedalus with nuclear pulse engines.
Yeah, we don't talk about actual true spacefaring civilizations either.
We don't talk about space propulsion or any means of propulsion either. We just have these greenhouse things onto a ship that gets launched off somewhere by some unknown mechanism. I thought this is perfect to indulge in talking about all kinds of things like fusion engine, nuclear pulse drive, buzzsaw ramjet,
solar sails.
Yeah, solar cell, laser cell, microwave cells, magneto cells, Koorevaar drive. Just go hog wild in this sci-fi-ish episode, but they didn't do any of that. And I don't know why, because it seems the perfect opportunity. Instead, we waste time talking about fucking UFOs in Area 51.
Yeah, really. But we have to contend with brains in boxes, and it seemed like their only project was terraforming, which I guess is possible. Fine, but yeah.
Well, the thing is that they're not really, I'm just trying to refresh my memory on this. Were they terraforming to extract stuff out of the planet to build their ships, or were they actually trying to make the planet more inhabitable?
That
was the primary reason, although that other thing you mentioned was probably a good solid secondary reason for it. But
because I thought that was the bit where I thought they're going to throw to geoengineering. Instead, they throw to a futurologist, which I've discussed in one of our previous hangout. Yeah. It's a ridiculous title because literally anyone can call themselves a futurologist. Anyone who's read any amount of science fiction, like me, I could turn around and put futurologist in my bio, and you don't need a qualification.
You'll be hired by Boing Boing in a second. Yes.
You just need to have opinions about technology. Not even necessarily informed opinions, just have opinions. You've read some sci-fi, it's like people who are armchair generals after reading some Tom Clancy novels. Futurologist is a bit like that, but moving away from that with the whole harnessing energy thing with solar energy, and that brings up another thing. Once again, this civilization had 4 billion years, and I thought, okay, are they going to do some interesting energy harnessing? No, they just have these flimsy solar panels that get destroyed by solar flares, and the solar panels aren't even really huge. I'm just thinking back in the 70s and 80s when they were proposing these orbital power stations that beam microwave energy back to Earth, that have these orbital satellites that are kilometers wide. It's so unambitious. That is the thing that I feel about this particular episode, that they have supposedly a hyper advanced civilization, and they have the technology that they show technology that we could probably build now if we have the will to do it. This civilization has been around for 4 billion years, and they didn't even build a goddamn Dyson sphere to harness energy.
It's not even a Dyson belt. It's not even Dyson. It's a die. And that's what they did later. They just die.
Yeah, they just die. Like the little bitches that they are. That's what they deserve. So they have this hive mind thing, which they just throw out there and didn't really go into, because they went to then talk to evolutionary biologists about octopus, which once again, octopus are really extremely interesting. And the way that they process the information is also really different from human beings as well, because instead of having just a centralized brain, They have arms that almost kind of think for themselves, so to speak. Yeah, that is a very good example of like an intelligence that is really, really alien, but not nearly quite alien enough, I feel, because it is still a single individual organism as opposed to something like ants and termites. And termite and ant colony often have these so-called emergence behavior where individuals within the colonies, they don't do anything particularly smart, but as a whole, they manage to somehow perform, like make some really smart decisions and do smart things. That's a really different form of intelligence to what we have, where we are brains trapped inside our own individual body. This kind of dispersed thinking, trying to wrap your head around that is a really alien type of intelligence. And you will think it's the perfect opportunity to talk about something like that, given that they mentioned hive mind at the start of the episode.
Right. And you don't even talk about bees.
Yeah. So they didn't talk about that. And even then, I'm talking about examples from the animal kingdom. We're not even bringing up things like slime molds, which they don't have any neurons, let alone a brain, but they're able to do intelligent things like navigate themselves through a maze. They're able to like form connecting network between food sources. In fact, for a while, one of the things that scientists who study slime molds did was to actually put like bits of oats in an arrangement that replicates that of major cities in various countries and get the slime molds to build road-like networks around them. And often these slime molds independently build networks that replicate either the highway or the road system or the rail system of many of these countries. And this thing does it without a single neuron, without a single brain. This is a truly alien intelligence, and we're still talking about an organism that is alive on Earth and that are kind of related to us in this larger group of organisms. We're not even moving away from the Opus vocans, which are the group that fungi and animals and all of that kind of organisms belong to. Like the Uniconta, yeah, that's the group. It's an unranked group because it's so much higher than even like kingdom. But Uniconta is a group that encompasses things like amoeba and slime molds and fungi and animals. And so this really alien intelligence, these slime molds, are still things that are kind of related to us. We're not even talking about aliens, So I guess that brings up the question of like, what do we call intelligence? Because I often find with many of these nature documentaries, especially documentaries talk about aliens, they seem to imply that we have a really good grasp of what intelligence actually means when we have no freaking idea. What does intelligence mean? What does it mean to be intelligent? So that's kind of, going way over the head of like this particular show. It's way too, I'm talking about things that are way too smart for this show.
Yeah, so they'd be like, whoa, now you got to dial that back a bit.
Yeah. So they have these self-replicating robots, and then they go over to talking about a planetary physicist and talk about these self-replicating robots, which the sci-fi heads would know as von Neumann machines, which are these self-replicating robots that can build themselves, and you can seed them around, say, a star system, and they can build more of themselves and build other things as well. So they kind of hinted at that. But the robots that these aliens have in the greenhouse, there is like, once again, no indication that they do anything nearly as fantastic as even building more of themselves. And then they send the greenhouse up into space, and they got fucked up by solar flare because these guys never heard of shielding.
I want to back up in the episode a little bit here and talk a little bit about the solar collecting station that they had there, because they didn't, I mean, they didn't talk about how that worked at all. And I think it's really kind of a cool thing. And I do want to give it a little bit of time here because it is totally not like a normal, what they call a photovoltaic panel. A photovoltaic panel, as far as I remember, works by sunlight knocking an electron off of an atom. And I believe it's like silicon or something like that. What they're doing is they are using mirrors as solar collectors to shine on a central tower. And it's called concentrated solar power plant. So they have an additional photovoltaic system off to the side, but because it's being built in 3 phases. So the first phase, of course, is this concentrating solar collector using mirrors to concentrate a bunch of light all at once on this tower that then converts that into, I believe, heat energy. and then just powers a turbine. I think that's how that works.
That particular kind of system, I remember reading in things like Popular Science or Popular Mechanic has been proposed for Australia, but I guess there's a lot of like political and ecological issues that you got to think about because that does occupy a lot of space. And despite what people think, many deserts are ecosystem in itself. It's not just a complete wasteland.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but that has been proposed for like, basically any countries that have large expanses of desert to have these solar tower type energy. And to be honest, like Australia's energy infrastructure could be significantly upgraded and make use of more solar energy, but I won't go into that right now.
So the other thing about this particular plant that I found interesting when I read about it years back, they're implementing it bit by bit, but it uses molten salt as a way to store energy overnight. So molten salt, not just like regular table salt here, but like other chemical salts that they're just like water. Once you get them to a certain temperature, they just melt, and because they stay that way for a long time, and we're talking thousands and thousands of degrees. And that's all part of the concentrating solar array there. I just think that's pretty neat that, people are like, oh, what happens at night with solar power? You can't, do that. But again, even though solar power is like awesome and whatnot at collecting energy, we need a huge amount of space to do it. And that's why we talk about things like Dyson spheres for more advanced civilizations. And maybe we should go into a little bit about what an actual Dyson sphere is too.
Well, it's a device that captures all of the solar output of a star.
It's basically you build an entire sphere that encompasses the entire star. For example, if you get Earth and Earth's orbit, and then you have a sphere that is the diameter of Earth's orbit, and then just basically encompass the sun in that. It's a common concept in science fiction, and it was proposed by Freeman Dyson, hence the name Dyson sphere. But these are kind of like the kind of mega structure that you see in a lot of science fiction that are built by hyper advanced civilizations, which was what I was expecting when they tell me that this Sprang and Jar civilization were hyper advanced.
Right. So does that mean that they can travel between stars? Nope. Okie dokie. I mean, you could send your robot probes, I guess. That would be a great idea. The robots can build whatever they need, whatever engine they need.
I mean, the thing is that they send up their greenhouse and stuff like, and it goes back to the whole like, oh, they have become decorporeal and they've let go of the body. Then why bother sending up these greenhouses? And
why bother having a brain?
Once again, going back to what I was saying before about uploading yourself into a more compact and durable substrate, why they didn't do that for their ship. But once again, I'm giving the show far more credit and far more thought than the producers of the show obviously did. When you talk about hyper advanced civilization that's been explored in science fiction, including overlaps with some of the things that they touch on in this episode. For example, I'm thinking of a science fiction novel by Greg Egan called Diaspora, where human civilization have kind of split off into all these different forms. So for example, you have the so-called fleshers, which are beings that still retain a body, but that doesn't mean that they have the bog standard human bodies. Some of them have like many different divergent types, and that was instantly in the story one of the things that's like made a global Earth civilization impossible because they're so different. There's also the so-called Glyster Robots, which are software-based consciousness, but they're housed inside a physical body and live out in the asteroid belt, because when you're in a robot body, you don't have like the limitation of being in a flesh bag. And then you have the citizens, which are the majority of, I guess, sapient being in the civilization diaspora, which are full uploads in simulated reality. And they live in these things called policies or escapes, which are this kind of solar system-wide internet network almost. And that's on the lower end of hyper advanced civilization that has been explored in like various types of science fiction. And they really missed an opportunity to explore things like that with the show.
Yeah, I agree.
They also talk about the Arecibo message, I think, near the end of the episode.
Oh yeah, that's right.
But that's one of the things that bugs me about that. It really bugs me. A lot of things bug me about this show, if you didn't know. But I also kind of want to like introduce people to other concepts that they just barely scratch the surface on. And one of the things that they didn't talk about is a lot of this stuff that they're setting out is in binary, or they use mathematical things first. And that's because math is what we consider to be a universal language. And you were talking about like a marker of intelligence, right? Like, how do we define intelligence? Well, do we do the ability to perform math? Is that intellect?
So like we could encounter some civilization that is like akin to slime molds of.
Exactly.
One of the questions that never get asked is that people kind of assume that aliens would just immediately recognize us as intelligent being because they are just, they would be just like us. Many of the aliens that I see people kind of think about, even astrobiologists, they still think about them in terms of like animals and things that are like us. What if they're so aliens that they look at us and they don't really recognize us as like intelligent beings, just like how most people, when they look at ants and an ant colony, they don't think about it making choices and being smart, even though they have this kind of hive mind emergence intelligence that is very different from the kind of intelligence that you find in individualistic organisms like ourselves. So would they even recognize us as intelligent, or they just kind of say that thing that people have said about other animals? Is that, well, they seem to behave in a semi-intelligent way, but I don't know if we could really call these things. They build like things and structures, and they seem to have some kind of like internet thing, but like, would we really call them civilization? They haven't really established themselves into the planet's substrate through a universal wide network. Like, what is their marker of intelligence? No one ever really think about that. We just kind of assume like, well, we would be recognized as intelligent being, right? Well, not necessarily, given our own behaviors.
That kind of brings up memories of a short story I read about these aliens that are truly alien. They're not even carbon-based, cruising through going, oh, wait, isn't this the planet full of things that talk with their meat and they're made of meat?
Oh, is it the one by Terry Besson? They're made out of meat?
Yep, that's the one. So yeah, it's like we could be looking at like, passing asteroid or something, and that could be an intellect itself, right? We don't even know.
We don't know what constitute as intelligence. And like, this guy who wants to send out the signal, this kind of bright-eyed bushy-tail guy who wants to send out the signal to talk to the aliens, but like, do the aliens want to talk to us, and what are their intentions? Because if they're aliens, like, I'm not necessarily saying that they want to invade Earth, because what the heck is on Earth that they couldn't possibly get anywhere else in the universe or in the solar system for that matter? But like, what motivates them? What would aliens make of us? They wouldn't see us necessarily as equal if they even recognize us as being intelligent in the first place. Like, do we really want to know? Especially seeing how we don't know what they are, what motivates them. The phrase stranger danger pops into my mind. Like, some people might think, oh, I'm being really close-minded about aliens. It's like, no, you guys aren't being open-minded enough about aliens, about what actually motivates them.
Or even if they have anything that we could consider to be motivation.
Yeah. Like, people seem to project their own motives onto aliens, like in terms of, what they think of us and what they want to do with us, assuming they want to do anything with us at all. Like, this guy who wants to send out the signal into space, they kind of go like, well, Earth's been around for like long enough that if they wanted to wipe us out, they would have already done so already. But once again, it's one of those things where these ideas have been better explored in science fiction. So for example, in Alistair Reynolds' series Revelation Space, they have this interstellar starfaring civilization, which, by the way, still adhere to the light speed limit. But what happened was that when these beings called the wolves that are built into the fabric of space-time, the sole raison d'etre is that when they detect signs of civilizations, they start emerging and go about doing these massive astral engineering projects to basically wipe out civilization, because that has become the thing that they exist for. So maybe they're just kind of waiting It was like, well, if it's just a bunch of goop in the pool, they don't really care. But when you start, sending out signals, say, hey, here we are, they go, okay, get them, get them. So, these aliens are by definition outside context problems. We have no idea what they are, what form they take, what they want to do with us. And we're sending out signals to them. I actually entertained the notion that possibly they find us really annoying. And the reason that we don't hear from aliens, because one thing they didn't bring up in the show is the so-called Fermi paradox, which is the idea that the universe has been around for long enough that alien civilization would have arisen, yet how come we don't detect them? Why don't we hear signals of them and stuff like that? And one thing about the Fermi paradox that I just thought of like last week while thinking about the show is maybe they blocked us. Maybe they just come across our civilization, found us annoying, and they blocked us, like on Twitter. So they blocked us from the universe Twitter, and they don't see us, and we're just shouting into the void.
Yeah.
And they go, oh, let's not talk to this guy. They're really annoying. So maybe we've been blocked. Maybe that would be a really, I guess, for some science fiction author to explore the idea that the Fermi paradox exists because no one wants to talk to us. And that's kind of what Terry Basson's they made our meat story is that no one wants to talk to us. And that's why we don't hear from them. That's why the Fermi paradox exists. Not because alien civilization necessarily have arisen and disappear and wipe themselves out, but because they're out there doing cool shit, but they think we're such like pathetic little beings that they go, oh, we don't want them mangling us. And so they blocked us. And so we don't hear from them. Assuming other explanations, like maybe they communicate in ways that we can't tap into. And so that's why we don't hear from them.
They also don't talk about the great filter, which is another concept kind of in the same vein of Fermi's paradox. So the great filter is basically the brick wall that civilizations hit at the end of their lifespan that causes them to die out.
Yeah.
So they're talking about the ability to move beyond one star and galaxy. Yeah. It's like we don't have those kind of galaxy-faring civilizations because there's some kind of filter in place, whether it's civilization itself collapsing because of societal problems that can't be addressed or because of natural causes, I guess you could say, like a big friggin' rock coming out of the sky and completely wiping out a 130 million year old species, or as in the context of non-avian dinosaurs on Earth.
I guess that's the thing that this civilization in episode 4 is trying to avoid being wiped out because they've been sitting on their asses for the last 4 billion years doing nothing. But yeah, basically my verdict is that this episode is probably the most let down out of all the episodes because in the previous episode it's related biology, at least they'll show me some cool biology stuff and stuff like that. Okay, this is episode 4. You got the hyper advanced civilization. You got all kinds of sci-fi stuff going on, I assume, and they didn't do any of that. They did nothing with that. They're like this. That's the limit of the ambition, is to be brains in jars in a greenhouse serviced by robot. And I find that actually really quite sad when you look at like hyper advanced civilization that has been depicted in what is capable of, like what does hyper advanced civilization mean? And the best they could do is, they do a bit of terraforming, but they're not very good at it.
It's like a very human-centric, like current human-centric.
Exactly. They're not even talking about I harp onto this so much, but any bit of science fiction that you've read, you would have encountered, for example, the culture novels by Ian M. Banks, which is a really good example of hyper advanced civilization. Also a really good example of the so-called fully automated luxury space communism.
Yes, I love that term.
I guess humanoids in this particular civilization, their society are basically run by these hyper advanced artificial intelligence, and all the humanoids or human equivalents, they don't really have to do anything with their life. They don't need a basic income at all because everything is provided for. They can live out for example, 40 years of their life as one particular sex or gender and then switch to a different body. They can even switch into a body of a different alien being, basically anything they want. The culture, the civilization will provide. And because of that, they don't even bother living on planets. They live in these megastructure called orbitals or rings or like Dyson sphere or these ginormous spaceships called general system vehicles that house like a population equivalent to that of like a country on Earth. And one of the novels was about how these guys got into a bit of a small war with this other civilization, these religious fanatics called the Idrians, who they have a thing against machine intelligence. And so they try to fight a war against the culture because the culture are run by machine intelligence. And at first they thought they were winning because the culture keeps on retreating. Every time that they advance, they kind of take over a planet and they hold that planet. And in their wake, the culture, they evacuate everyone. And then they demolish the megastructure to deny the Idrians a potential base or stronghold. And so they basically just completely stretch the logistic line of the Idrians. And then in the background, they start producing very rapidly their so-called rapid offensive units. They don't like wars. They don't like bad things, basically. So, but when it comes time to make war, they produce these like so-called rapid offensive units, which are warships that have idiosyncratic names. All the ships in the culture have idiosyncratic names that they name themselves. And also the warships, because they don't want to like glamorize warfare, they are all called things like, you know, psychopath class and killer class, basically things that they think are bad.
Oh, how festive.
Yeah. So this is turning into me plugging the culture novels. But honestly, you should read like the culture novels by Ian M. Banks because they're one of the best science fiction novel series out there. You know, when you talk about hyper advanced civilization, so just this is where I'm coming from here. Like this is the kind of stuff. And I'm not even going to start talking about the Seeleys in Stephen Baxter's like Seeley novels because that's a hyper advanced civilization.
I'll pull it back here because I do want to touch on a subject here. Like they talk about hyper advanced civilizations, and it makes sense that at least a fragment of that civilization might split off and be a spacefaring race. And it would have been kind of cool to show like, okay, what if these guys get blown off course? Say they're going to this planet that they terraformed, but they're in these greenhouses that are, I guess, self-sustaining. And unless they get hit by a magnetic storm or an EMP pulse from a solar flare. Like it would have been cool to see like an evolutionary path of like a completely accidentally spacefaring version of these brains in boxes. Would they be different to evolve to like the radiation factor? You know, because they did bring up that astronaut that was talking about the collision of the Mir space station and like hazards of space radiation.
I guess they try to get around that by describing these beings as being hive mind, which to most people they think the bog and it's all assimilated and it's all one unified, which project more about their own fear about individualism and communism and stuff like that. But like that doesn't mean that you don't have like individual branches that could split off and go down their own different paths.
There's so much they could have done with this that would have been really super cool.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, so I guess, you know, given we've talked about this whole show, what are your kind of wrap-up impression about the show and what did you get out of it, if anything?
It kind of reminded me that, you know, there's some really cool ideas and stuff like that could be explored and are out there. That if nothing else, the show is definitely stimulating. I mean, our podcast is definitely evidence of that, I think. And, you know, for good or for ill, you know, really. There's a lot we would see differently. There was a lot I would do differently for sure, but I still enjoyed the show overall and wouldn't mind seeing it again. Maybe after I'm done watching Star Trek, the original series or whatever, I'll get back to that.
My general impression is the show suffered from a lack of overall editing.
Cohesion,
yeah. Cohesion in the editing process. It's like, oh my God, we've got all this kind of cool, disparate stuff, and we got to find a way to just mash it all together. Now, I think with episode 4, just because of the concepts they were dealing with, it was easier to stitch these disparate portions together because the theme made sense. You actually had an overarching theme, whereas like the other episodes, I really had to kind of sit there and puzzle out what the theme was for every episode. So when you said like for episode 2 in the last podcast, about convergent evolution as being the overarching theme. I wasn't getting that at all. But now that you mentioned it, they wanted to do a lot with this, and they did a lot. But it's like they wanted to do too much, I think, and just scaling it back in terms of how much stuff can we cram into this 10-pound sack, I think really would have made it just that much more punchy. Netflix is a notorious studio for really pushing its workers, like making them work really, really long hours, and they want a 6-month turnaround time on a lot of like animated shows. And if anybody listening works in animation, you know how friggin' insane that is to turn around a whole show in 6 to 9 months. No way.
I wonder what they could have done with a larger budget and or more time, for sure.
We do harp on the creators of the show a lot in this series of podcasts we've done, but really we do kind of come from a place of love, not only of the show, which I thought was rather enjoyable myself, definitely better than some of the documentaries out there, but also a love of the topics that were discussed. We really like what they talked about there, and it's really kind of discouraging that they didn't go more into depth on a lot of these things. And time and budgets notwithstanding, swapping around of some of the sequences maybe would have made the show a little better.
Yeah, about the topics, I get that the show is using the alien footages as a way to frame all these separate topics, but watching all of this, I kind of wish they just didn't do like the whole gimmick of Alien Worlds documentary and just did the latest and greatest in like the world of science. I guess they wanted to have that as a kind of a hook or draw, but so much of the episodes are devoted to these what felt like quite pointless alien footages. The alien footage, I feel like they should be in service of the real actual science, which does not seem to be the case here. Like I don't know whether the sciencey topic and the interviews with the experts are supposed to serve to support the aliens or whether the aliens are there to serve the experts. And I feel like it should be the aliens are there to serve the experts. So cut down a bit on the alien and you could spend a bit more time on making something more interesting by reducing the amount of like alien B-rolls you have to produce.
Right, because they've recycled parts of the footage like 4 or 5 times, if I counted correctly.
Yeah, which I kind of expected, but like instead of recycling the footage, why not just put in a bit more stuff talking about...
Explain the science more.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like this is like an extremely compromised show. Out of the 3 of us, I think I'm the one who's the most down on the show, probably because I'm the worst possible person to be watching a show like this. Because when it comes to like the biology stuff and the sciencey stuff, I'm a professional working biologist. So many of the stuff I'm already familiar with and wish that they delve into a lot more detail. So I didn't gain any new insight from the show. There are already things that I have like at least some partial familiarity with, and the superficial treatment that they give certainly didn't enlighten me. Maybe it inspires people to go on Wikipedia to read more about some of the topics they brought up.
Gosh, I sure hope so.
No, that's the best I could say. So I'm a professional biologist. So the biologist and sciencey bit left me really quite cold. The alien bits, well, I'm also a big science fiction nerd. So I've seen many iterations of like alien life and hyper advanced civilizations and all that kind of stuff. And the stuff that they showed me felt like fast food, junk food. Not even good junk food. They're just like budget, tasteless kind of junk food. So like I said, my personal opinion, being the kind of person that I am, I'm the worst possible person to be showing the show to. There are other people like you guys probably like got more out of the show, but I personally, if someone asked me what I got out of the show, is content. It allowed me to generate content in the form of this podcast episode.
And that's fair.
So out of all of us, I'm the one who's probably the most out. I'm the party pooper. Go in with an open mind. I certainly went in an open mind, but maybe I had like expectations that are higher. Make up your own mind about the show, because it seems that out of the 3 of us, we have two kind of lukewarm endorsement and one very critical reception towards it.
Yeah, I think actually I'm the Goldilocks zone, if you will, between you and Scott as far as opinions are concerned, because the fourth episode, like you said, they could have done a lot more with making the aliens more aliens instead of just brain in jars.
Fourth episode really bummed me out because it's like, man, you had like all these opportunities to talk about sci-fi stuff, you know, sending off your alien greenhouses to other star system, and you didn't even mention any kind of like exotic theoretical or actually being research type of propulsions like ion drives and fusion drives and like laser cells and microwave cells. So much potential. You know, you could make like magnetic cells, which doubles as both a means of propulsion, but also as a way of shielding the spacecraft itself. God, just so much, I think, missed opportunity is how I felt about this show. They cram in so much stuff and they did such a superficial treatment of it. I hope many of the experts that got interviewed, they get their little time in the limelight. I hope some good things happen to them in terms of like opportunities would open up for them. So I guess the best I could say is that I hope many of the professionals who were interviewed and took their time with this particular show, that they got the kind of exposure that they need in order to have like more opportunity to do other things in the future. For viewers like myself, especially viewers specifically myself, it's like, well, I got an episode or two of podcasts out of it, so
That's true.
I made content.
And I think with that, Scott, unless you've got something else to say, that's a good place to wrap this up here.
Nope, that sounds good to me.
All right, well, thank you very much for listening to us babble on about alien worlds on Netflix. We'll see you in the next episode.